In March 1945, when most believed the war was won, Wehrmacht forces launched a desperate counteroffensive near the Rhine. One British position stood directly in their path, a crumbling farmhouse defended by 35 exhausted men and a 58-year-old officer whom High Command had tried to retire 3 times. What happened next would rewrite the rulebook on asymmetric warfare and prove that experience, not youth, wins impossible battles. Major William Ashford stood in the rain outside brigade headquarters in Venlo, Netherlands, reading his reassignment orders for the 3rd time. The paper was already soaking through, ink bleeding across the words "unsuitable for forward deployment due to age considerations." He was 58 years old. His knees ached in cold weather. His hearing in the left ear had been damaged by artillery fire in the Great War. By every reasonable metric, the young staff officers inside that warm building were right to send him back to a training depot in England. But reasonable metrics had never won William Ashford's wars. He folded the orders into his jacket pocket and walked toward the front-line positions anyway. The date was March 19th, 1945. The temperature hovered around 4 degrees Celsius. The ground was sodden with spring rain that had been falling for 6 days straight, turning every road into a morass and every foxhole into a cold bath. The Rhine crossing operations were scheduled to begin in 5 days, and every available unit was being positioned for the final push into Germany, which made the intelligence report he'd read that morning all the more troubling. Wehrmacht forces were massing east of their position, not retreating as everyone assumed, but concentrating. Specifically, the remnants of the 116th Panzer Division, bloodied but not broken, showing unusual radioactivity and troop movements that suggested something other than withdrawal. Ashford had seen this pattern before in 1918, when German forces had launched their spring offensive. Desperate men don't always retreat. Sometimes they attack. He found the forward position exactly where the maps indicated. A cluster of farm buildings, 3 kilometers from the Rhine, holding the northern approach to the bridge site. The position was generous terminology. What he actually found was a half-collapsed stone farmhouse, 2 outbuildings with their roofs caved in, and a muddy field surrounded by hedgerows that provided concealment, but no real cover. 35 men occupied this position. They were from the 1st Battalion, Royal Scots, veterans of Normandy and the Rhineland campaign, but now reduced to half-strength after months of continuous combat. Their commanding officer, Captain Peters, had been evacuated with pneumonia 2 days earlier. The senior sergeant, a Glaswegian named McGregor, with shoulders like bridge supports and a face carved from Aberdeen granite, met Ashford at the farmhouse entrance. "Sir," McGregor said, his tone carefully neutral. "We weren't expecting a replacement officer." "You weren't getting one," Ashford replied. "I'm not your replacement. I'm just an old man who can't follow simple orders." He looked past McGregor into the farmhouse interior, where exhausted soldiers were trying to dry their uniforms near a struggling fire. "How's your ammunition?" 300 rounds per rifle, 4 Bren guns with 40 magazines between them, 2 Piat anti-tank weapons with 8 projectiles total, 6 grenades per man. McGregor's recitation was precise, the inventory of a professional who knew exactly how little he had to work with. "We're supposed to be relieved tomorrow before the Rhine crossing begins." "You won't be." Ashford pulled out a folded map, already marked with his own annotations. "German radio intercepts show unusual concentration east of here, the 116th Panzer Division specifically. They're not retreating. They're preparing to disrupt our staging areas before we can cross the Rhine." He pointed to their position on the map. "This farmhouse controls the northern approach. If I wanted to hit our crossing operations where they're most vulnerable, I'd come straight through here with everything I had left." McGregor studied the map, then studied Ashford. "Brigade doesn't believe that. Brigade thinks I'm a paranoid old man seeing ghosts from the last war." Ashford smiled without humor. "They're half right. I am old, but these aren't ghosts." He looked around at the crumbling farmhouse, the exhausted men, the inadequate defensive position. Every tactical instinct he'd developed over 40 years of military service was screaming that this position was a death trap. 35 men couldn't hold this ground against a determined company-strength assault, let alone anything larger. But if he was right about the German intentions, abandoning this position meant leaving the northern flank of the entire Rhine crossing operation exposed. Thousands of men would be landing across that river in 5 days. If German forces broke through here and hit the staging areas from the north, the entire operation could collapse into chaos. "Right," Ashford said. "I need to speak to every man here. And then I need to explain to you how 35 tired soldiers are going to hold ground that should require 300. McGregor's expression shifted from neutral assessment to something approaching respect. "You're staying then, sir? I was told I'm too old to fight." Ashford hung his wet jacket on a nail by the door and rolled up his sleeves. "Let's prove that sometimes too old means too experienced to die stupidly." The rain continued falling. In the distance, German radio operators continued their suspicious traffic. And in a cold farmhouse in the Netherlands, a 58-year-old major who'd been dismissed as obsolete began planning the kind of defense that couldn't be taught in staff college. The kind learned only through surviving impossible situations and refusing to accept death as inevitable. The clock was ticking. Somewhere east of their position, 700 Wehrmacht soldiers were preparing to march. And William Ashford was preparing to teach them why experience matters more than youth when the bullets start flying. The next 18 hours were brutal, systematic, and utterly exhausting. Ashford didn't sleep. Neither did anyone else. What he proposed wasn't a defensive position, it was a killing mechanism built from desperation, mathematics, and the accumulated tactical knowledge of 4 decades watching men die unnecessarily. March 20th, 0400 hours. The rain had briefly stopped, leaving everything covered in cold mist. Ashford gathered the 35 men in the farmhouse and spread his annotated map on a wooden table. "Conventional defensive doctrine says we should dig in here, create overlapping fields of fire, and hold until relieved or overwhelmed," he began. His voice was hoarse from years of shouting over artillery, but still carried authority. "Conventional doctrine assumes we have the numbers to trade casualties. We don't. If we fight conventionally, we die conventionally." Private Morrison, a 19-year-old from Manchester who'd lied about his age to enlist, raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir, if we can't defend normally, what can we do? We stop thinking like defenders and start thinking like hunters." Ashford's finger traced movement patterns on the map. "German doctrine is predictable because it's effective. They'll advance with reconnaissance elements first, then concentrate force at identified weak points, then break through with armored support if available. Their entire system depends on identifying where we are and applying overwhelming force at that location." He looked up at the assembled faces. "So we're going to make sure they never know where we are." The concept he outlined was radical, dangerous, and completely contrary to established British defensive doctrine. Instead of fixed positions, they would create a fluid defense based on movement, misdirection, and violence of action. Small teams would operate independently across the entire farmhouse complex, appearing at unexpected angles, inflicting casualties, then vanishing before the enemy could concentrate return fire. The Germans would be forced to search for them, waste ammunition shooting at empty positions, and exhaust themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't pin down. Sergeant McGregor understood immediately. Mobile defense, like the tactics the Finns used against the Soviets in 1940. "Exactly," Ashford nodded. "But we need infrastructure." For the next 12 hours, the 35 men transformed the farmhouse complex into something between a fortress and a maze. They knocked firing holes through stone walls at irregular heights, some at floor level, some shoulder high, some near the ceiling, reached only by makeshift ladders. They created false positions with helmets on sticks and empty uniforms stuffed with straw. They dug concealed tunnels between buildings, allowing movement without exposure to enemy fire. They positioned the Bren guns on makeshift platforms that could be rapidly moved via pulley systems. so the same weapon could fire from 3 different locations within minutes. They worked with the intensity of men who understood their lives depended on every detail. Lance Corporal Davies, a Welsh coal miner whose peacetime job had been working in tight spaces underground, led the tunnel construction. "Back home, we'd shore these up proper with timber," he muttered while crawling through muddy excavations. "But they'll hold long enough for what we need." Private Thompson, who'd been a carpenter in Leeds, constructed movable firing platforms from salvaged timber. Corporal Johnson, who'd poached deer in Scotland before the war, positioned concealed observation posts in the hedgerows where watchers could remain invisible while tracking enemy movements. By midday, the complex looked unchanged from outside, still a half-ruined farmhouse and broken outbuildings. But inside, it had been transformed into an interconnected system designed for one purpose, allowing a handful of men to appear everywhere simultaneously while actually being nowhere predictable. The ammunition situation remained dire. 300 rounds per rifle might last 20 minutes in sustained combat. Ashford instituted brutal fire discipline rules. No shots beyond 150 meters, no suppressive fire, no shooting unless absolutely certain of a hit. Every bullet had to count. "In the Boer War," he told them during a brief rest, "I watched Boer farmers hold off entire British columns with hunting rifles because they refused to waste a single shot. We're going to do the same." March 20th, 1800 hours. The rain returned, heavier now. A dispatch rider arrived from brigade with written orders. The position would be relieved at 800 the following morning, March 21st, and all personnel would withdraw to staging areas for the Rhine crossing. Ashford read the orders and filed them without comment. McGregor caught his eye. "Sir, we'll follow those orders if we're still alive at 800 tomorrow." Ashford checked his watch. "German forces will move tonight under cover of darkness. They'll be in position by dawn. If I'm wrong, we withdraw as ordered, and I face court-martial for disobeying my reassignment. If I'm right..." He didn't finish the sentence. Everyone understood. The final preparation was psychological. Ashford gathered them one last time before dusk. "Most of you are exhausted. You've been fighting since Normandy. You've watched friends die. You want this war to end." He spoke quietly without false heroics. "You deserve rest. You deserve relief. You deserve to go home." He paused. "But if we abandon this position tonight, hundreds of men will die at the river crossing tomorrow when German forces hit our staging areas from the north. Not because those men aren't brave, not because they aren't well trained, but because we weren't here to stop what's coming." Private Morrison, the teenager from Manchester, spoke up. "Sir, they said you're too old to fight. Why are you still here?" Ashford smiled tiredly. "Because I'm too old to waste my life dying stupidly, and I'm too experienced to let you waste yours. Experience means I've survived 27 years of people trying to kill me. Tonight, I'm going to teach 700 Germans why that's significant." The night fell cold and wet. In the farmhouse complex, 35 men settled into positions, checked weapons for the 20th time, and waited. Somewhere in the darkness east of their location, Wehrmacht forces were beginning their approach, and William Ashford, the officer nobody wanted, sat in the ruins of a farmhouse and calculated firing angles with the precision of a man who'd spent 40 years learning how to make impossible odds merely difficult. March 21st, 0347 hours. The rain had stopped 20 minutes earlier, leaving the night cold, quiet, and wrapped in thick ground fog. Private Morrison, positioned in the eastern hedgerow observation post, heard them first, the distinctive sound of equipment moving carefully through darkness, not the confident march of an advancing army. The cautious, professional movement of reconnaissance troops probing for enemy positions. He tapped the signal wire twice. In the farmhouse, Ashford received the alert and checked his watch, right on schedule. "They're here," he said quietly to McGregor. "Pass the word. Nobody fires until I give the signal. Let them come in close." The German reconnaissance element, 12 men from the 116th Panzer Division's advance scouts, approached the farmhouse complex with textbook caution. They'd done this hundreds of times: identify enemy positions, mark firing points, withdraw to report, then watch as artillery and superior numbers crush the defense. The ruined farmhouse ahead showed no lights, no movement, no signs of occupation. Perhaps the British had already withdrawn. The German squad leader, Feldwebel Richter, a veteran who'd survived Russia and Normandy, signaled his men to spread out and advance. They moved forward in careful bounds, covering each other, weapons ready, standard doctrine, professional execution. They walked straight into Ashford's trap. The signal came when 8 Germans had entered the farmhouse courtyard. Not gunfire, that would come later. Instead, a simple hand gesture from Ashford to MacGregor to Davies, and suddenly the abandoned farmhouse erupted with precisely coordinated violence. Bren guns opened fire from 3 angles simultaneously, positions the Germans hadn't identified because they hadn't existed during their initial observation. Rifle fire from elevated positions caught the reconnaissance troops in a crossfire they couldn't escape. The engagement lasted 43 seconds. 11 Germans died. The 12th, wounded, managed to crawl back to his lines to deliver a confused, terrified report. Richter's final report to his company commander was stark. Heavy resistance, multiple machine guns, estimate company strength defensive position, request artillery support before main assault. That report was exactly what Ashford had engineered. He wanted the Germans to believe they faced conventional strength. He wanted them to waste artillery on empty buildings. He wanted them to commit to a frontal assault against what they thought was a standard defensive position. 0520 hours. German artillery began. For 20 minutes, shells hammered the farmhouse complex in a methodical bombardment designed to suppress defenders before the infantry assault. But the defenders weren't where the Germans expected. They'd withdrawn through the concealed tunnels into positions the artillery couldn't reach. Basement spaces, reinforced corners, underground shelters Davies had excavated. They listened to the world exploding above them and waited. When the artillery stopped, Ashford knew what was coming next. "Positions," he ordered. The 35 men emerged from their shelters and took up firing points in the wreckage. The bombardment had actually helped them. Collapsing walls created new firing angles. Debris provided additional cover. Dust and smoke gave concealment. 0545 hours. The main German assault began. This wasn't a reconnaissance probe. This was 3 full companies, approximately 450 men, advancing in coordinated waves with machine gun support and mortar teams. A textbook Wehrmacht attack executed by battle-hardened veterans who'd driven across France and defended against Allied offensives for months. Against a conventional defensive position held by 35 men, this assault should have succeeded in under 10 minutes. But Ashford wasn't fighting conventionally. The Germans advanced, expecting suppressed defenders in fixed positions. Instead, they encountered something they'd never trained for: defenders who weren't where they were supposed to be. A Bren gun would fire from one window, killing 3 men, then fall silent. When the Germans concentrated fire on that position and advanced, the gun was already gone, moved via pulley system to a completely different location where it would open fire again from an unexpected angle. Riflemen appeared in positions the Germans had already cleared, fired with devastating accuracy at ranges under 100 meters, then vanished into tunnels before return fire could find them. The Piat anti-tank weapons, normally used against vehicles, were employed against concentrations of infantry in the open, the explosions creating psychological terror disproportionate to actual casualties. Ashford orchestrated the defense like a conductor, moving between positions, directing fire, calculating ammunition expenditure, and maintaining the illusion that the farmhouse complex contained far more defenders than actually existed. His experience showed in every decision: when to fire, when to hold, where the Germans would commit their reserves, how to make 35 men appear to be 300. By 0630 hours, the German assault had stalled. They'd taken the outer hedgerows at brutal cost. but couldn't advance into the farmhouse complex itself without suffering unacceptable casualties. Their commander, Major Vogel, studied the battlefield in growing frustration. His intelligence had said minimal resistance. His reconnaissance had reported company strength, but the resistance his troops faced felt like an entire battalion. How many British were actually in that farmhouse? The answer, 35, now reduced to 31 after 4 casualties, would have seemed impossible. So Vogel made the decision any competent officer would make. He committed his reserves. Another 250 men, the remnants of 2 additional companies, held back for the breakthrough phase. 700 Wehrmacht soldiers against what had to be a substantial British force. Ashford watched the German reserves deploying and allowed himself a grim smile. "They're committing everything," he told McGregor, "which means when we break them here, there's nothing left to hit our staging areas." "If we break them, sir," McGregor corrected. "When, Sergeant? Experience beats numbers when you refuse to fight on their terms." The second assault came at 0700 hours. And this time, the Wehrmacht brought everything. The final assault should have been overwhelming. 700 German soldiers, supported by mortars and machine guns, attacking a position held by 31 exhausted British defenders with ammunition running critically low. Every military manual ever written said the defense would collapse in minutes. Every staff college instructor would have calculated inevitable defeat. But William Ashford had never put much faith in manuals written by men who survived by avoiding impossible situations. He'd built his career on surviving them. 0702 hours. The German advance came as a massive, coordinated push, 3 companies attacking simultaneously from different angles, suppressing fire from support weapons, textbook combined arms assault. Against fixed positions, it would have been unstoppable. But Ashford's defense wasn't fixed. It was fluid, chaotic, and built on the principle that you can't destroy what you can't pin down. The key was movement. Small teams, never more than 3 men, operated independently, firing from one position, then immediately displacing to another before German return fire could find them. The Bren guns moved constantly, their distinctive sound appearing from impossible angles. Riflemen fired from concealed positions in rubble piles, then withdrew through tunnels to emerge somewhere completely different. Every shot was aimed, deliberate, designed to kill rather than suppress. The Germans adapted quickly. They were professionals who'd survived years of brutal combat, but adaptation requires time and observation, and Ashford gave them neither. His defense operated faster than their decision-making cycle. By the time German squad leaders identified a firing position and directed their men to suppress it, the British had already moved and were shooting from somewhere else entirely. Corporal Johnson, the former Scottish poacher, demonstrated the principle perfectly. Positioned in a concealed firing point in the collapsed barn, he killed 6 Germans in rapid succession, each shot dropping a man at ranges under 100 meters. When the Germans concentrated fire on his position, Johnson was already crawling through a tunnel exit 50 meters away. 30 seconds later, he was firing from a completely different angle. The Germans wasted hundreds of rounds shooting at empty space. But mathematics remained brutal. By 0730 hours, the defenders were down to 27 effectives. Ammunition stocks were critical. Most rifles down to fewer than 50 rounds, the Bren guns sharing their final magazines. The Piat weapons were expended. Grenades were nearly gone. They'd inflicted approximately 180 German casualties, but the Wehrmacht still had over 500 men in the fight. Major Vogel, commanding the German assault, couldn't understand what he was facing. His forces had taken 25% casualties against what should have been a rapidly collapsing defensive position. Every tactical indicator said the British were nearly finished. Their fire volume was decreasing, response times slowing, defensive perimeter contracting. But they wouldn't break. Every time his troops advanced, they encountered precisely placed fire from unexpected positions. It was like fighting shadows. At 07:45 hours, Vogel made his final decision. One concentrated push with every remaining soldier straight into the farmhouse complex. No more tactical maneuvering. Just mass and momentum overwhelming whatever remained of the defense. He committed every man he had left. Ashford watched the German assault forming up and knew this was the moment everything balanced on. They had perhaps 2 minutes of effective ammunition remaining. If they fired now and failed to break the German attack, they'd be overrun in close combat. But if they held fire and let the Germans get too close, they'd achieve the same result. The margin for error was 0. "McGregor," he said quietly, "when they reach the courtyard wall, 30 meters, we fire everything simultaneously. Every weapon, every round we have left. Complete violence of action for 60 seconds, then fix bayonets." The German assault came fast and committed. 400 soldiers in a compressed formation, betting everything on overwhelming force. They crossed open ground, taking casualties but continuing forward through discipline and momentum. They reached the outer hedgerows. They pushed through the garden. They approached the courtyard wall, 30 meters. "Now!" Ashford's voice carried across the defensive positions, every weapon fired. The 4 Bren guns, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, opened up simultaneously. 23 rifles fired in rapid aimed succession. The final grenades arced into the densest concentrations. For 60 seconds, the small British force generated firepower that sounded like company strength. The effect on the compressed German formation was catastrophic. In open ground, at point-blank range, there was nowhere to take cover. Men fell in clusters. The assault momentum broke not from cowardice, but from the simple physics of losing 30% of your force in under a minute. The Wehrmacht soldiers were brave, professional, experienced, but bravery doesn't stop bullets at 30 meters. The German assault collapsed, not routed. They withdrew in relatively good order, carrying their wounded. But broken nonetheless. Vogel stared at the shambles of his command and finally understood that he'd been outfought by something he couldn't quantify or predict. Not superior numbers, not better equipment, just tactical brilliance combined with desperate courage. 08:08 hours. The sound of engines approached from the west. British relief forces, a full company from the Royal Scots with armoured support, arrived to take over the position. They found 23 surviving defenders amid the ruins of the farmhouse, surrounded by German dead, their ammunition exhausted, several wounded but still fighting. And they found Major William Ashford, age 58, too old to fight according to official regulations, calmly directing the treatment of casualties and organizing ammunition resupply in case the Germans came back. The relief force commander, Captain Williams, surveyed the battlefield in disbelief. Over 200 German dead and wounded around the farmhouse, evidence of at least 700 enemy troops engaged, defensive position held against impossible odds. "Major Ashford," he asked carefully, "how many men did you have holding this position?" 35 when we started," Ashford replied. 23 now." He looked at the young officer with tired but steady eyes. "Turns out, being too old to fight just means you're too experienced to fight stupidly." The German attack had been stopped. The Rhine crossing operations proceeded on schedule without northern interference. Thousands of Allied soldiers crossed the river safely because a small force in a ruined farmhouse had held ground they had no reasonable expectation of holding. When the after-action reports were compiled, military analysts struggled to explain how the defense had succeeded. The numbers didn't make sense. The tactics violated established doctrine. By every conventional metric, the position should have fallen in the first hour, but Major Ashford had never fought conventionally. He'd fought with 4 decades of accumulated knowledge about how battles actually work versus how manuals say they should work. He'd fought with the understanding that experience, properly applied, can defeat youth, numbers, and conventional wisdom. After the war, the action at the Rhine farmhouse became a case study taught at staff colleges. an example of how tactical innovation, leadership, and refusal to accept inevitable defeat could overcome overwhelming odds. The surviving defenders received commendations. Several, including Sergeant McGregor and Private Morrison, were decorated for valor. Major William Ashford received a formal apology from brigade headquarters and a recommendation that age restrictions for field command be reconsidered in light of demonstrated competence. He declined further decoration, citing that his men had done the actual fighting. He retired 6 months after Germany surrendered, returning to his home in Somerset, where he lived quietly until 1967. But the real legacy wasn't in medals or military reforms. It was in the principle the battle demonstrated, that warfare isn't always won by the young, the strong, or the numerous. Sometimes it's won by those too experienced to waste lives following plans that ignore battlefield reality, too old to die foolishly, too skilled to fight conventionally, too determined to accept defeat as inevitable. In March 1945, 35 men held a farmhouse against 700 Wehrmacht soldiers because one 58-year-old officer refused to believe that age meant obsolescence. He proved that sometimes the most dangerous warrior isn't the youngest or strongest. It's the one who's survived long enough to learn how to make impossible odds merely difficult. And when the shooting stopped and the analysis was done, military historians reached a conclusion that should have been obvious from the start. Never dismiss experience as obsolescence. The old soldier may move slower. His hearing might be damaged. His knees might ache in cold weather. But he's learned something that can't be taught in staff college: how to survive when survival seems impossible. How to win when winning violates every rule. How to lead when leadership means refusing to accept death as inevitable. They called him too old to fight. He proved them wrong, one bullet at a time. If this story of extraordinary courage and tactical brilliance moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible true tales from the Second World War. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you know of other unsung heroes whose experience proved decisive? Hit the notification bell so you never miss these remarkable stories of British determination and ingenuity that changed history.